Coming to you direct from his custom-built deluxe solar-powered studio deep within the bowels of Empire State Suburbia, it's time for Stand Up with Pete Dominic.
Hello and welcome to Stand Up with Pete Dominic Daily. Hi. Hello there. Hi. Thank you for joining me. Great to see you here. Like I can see you. I'm in my shed. But I like painting that image. Thank you to John Carroll for the new introduction. If you'd like to send me anything to use for the show, from a news dump jingle to an introduction to anything else, ideas-wise, send it to standupwithpete@gmail.com. And all of these contributions from folks who listen and support the show has really got me thinking about how when I first started this program back in 2008, it was called Pete's Big Mouth when I started the 3-hour-a-day show at SiriusXM. Taken many iterations. It's obviously evolved. There have been some great moments, some awful moments, some exciting and brilliant and moving moments, some boring, offensive, and technically unlistenable moments throughout the history of the show. I'm not talking about the podcast, but the podcast, which is about a year and a half old and 345 episodes, of course, that's today, has certainly evolved. And I've evolved with it, learning new skills with editing, still constantly learning all the time. But just thinking about how the show changes and develops. But mostly, what can you contribute to it? It's really got me thinking about how, using all of this technology, we can have more ownership over this program, or you can. You know, when I started, that's what I was beginning to say, Pete's Big Mouth, I used to call it our show, because I really depended on the listeners for ideas. I mean, partially is because I wasn't working with a very experienced or talented team to begin with, frankly, until Brendan McDonald came on board, and he now is, of course, producing the Mark Maron podcast and has been for a long time, WTF. And Brendan was an amazing mentor to me and taught me so much, and I think the show really started to develop with his guidance. He was only there for about a year, and I worked with a whole bunch of other talented people, but really the listeners' contributions came because I needed help. I needed help with ideas. I needed help with content. I needed help filling the time with your phone calls, frankly, and it was great. I learned so much from listeners, and I continue to. But now, in the podcast iteration, we have also created a community, which is growing all the time. Hello to the 3 new subscribers that signed up today. Welcome. I really need to give the shout-outs of names, and I always need your help, because as you can see, producing 5 podcasts a week, booking 2 guests a day, almost every day, although Monday I only had 1 and today I only had 1, but both are amazing. People are still talking about Monday's episode with Dr. Merton Runnywolf, and today I've got the brilliant Tim Wise, a great conversation coming up with him. But I can use your help, and it's fun to help, and it's fun to feel, I know this, you tell me, an ownership and having a contribution to the show, whether it is heard on air with a jingle or an intro like we heard from John, the jingles from Pete Coe, or anybody else, whether your kids introduce me like Delaney did the other day, whether you're sending me, of course, guest ideas or criticism, compliments, telling me what you like or don't. There's so much feedback that I depend on, and I just want to throw it out there again to consider that this program is our show. I'm going to try to start saying that again. Is that hokey, J. Alcoban? Is that ridiculous? I said it at the beginning when I first started, and I feel that way a lot more now than I did then when I was at SiriusXM, which is a giant corporation. Now it really is our show. It's your show. Without your paid subscriptions, I can't do the show. This is my job. I'm a 45-year-old man standing in a shed trying to support my family with a podcast. I mean, it's not the most realistic or financially secure of ideas, but I love doing it, and I can't do it without you. And so your investment in it can be more than just 5 or 10 or 25, or several of you pay a lot more than that a month. And you can always edit your subscription up, by the way. And you don't have to. You don't have to pay at all. I mean, the podcast is free, frankly. But I mean, if you listen to it and get a lot out of it, then throw me $5 or $10 a month. There are so many different ways to contribute to the program, and why shouldn't it be crowdsourced? And so I'm trying to think of some new ideas, but just having Dropboxes online for you to drop audio clips into would be amazingly helpful to me. Really, really helpful. You're all listening to all different kinds of media, watching TV shows, listening to other podcasts, radio shows, books on tape, whatever. And I'm only one guy. I don't have a producer. I don't have an intern. I just have fake Keith. Right, Keith? Say hi, Keith. Hello, everybody. Yep, he's finally spoken. I could use your help. So I was thinking about how we could do that. And if you're someone who is tech savvy and someone who is invested in this program, and so many of you are, and you've been with me for a long time, which so many of you have, and you'd like to make a contribution in terms of a suggestion and how we can use technology to help create and produce Everyday's podcast, I'm all for it. I mean, listen, if I came out here or check the quote Dropbox that I'm talking about at 2 o'clock, at 5 o'clock, at 8 o'clock, again at 10 o'clock, whatever, and I see it filling up with clips, and by the way, if that sounds intimidating, I'm not asking you to learn audio software. You could simply send me a link to something you saw on Twitter or on cable news if you see it. Hey, I was watching this show and this person said this. You could even describe it and I can easily find it. That way I can curate the type of content, the type of information, the type of clips that you would love to hear shared with others. You would love to hear analysis of, not only by me, your own. You could even send that. Hey, Pete, I saw this and thought this, and I can share it. I definitely have to set up a voicemail for the show so you can leave messages and thoughts on news and ideas, anything you want, so I can use that audio for the program. So I just thought it would be a cool thing to throw out there to you right now. What if part of this podcast and part of a podcast was user produced? The content was user generated. Of course, I'm always going to do the interviews, but hey, who am I interviewing? Always love your suggestions on any of the guests, of course. Maybe you should be the guest. But I just thought it'd be a great idea. I could always use any help, any suggestions, but I need them to be organized and streamlined to me. So it's a lot every day. And a lot of people are always concerned. Pete, are you doing too much? Maybe you're doing too much. Maybe you should just do this many episodes. No, I appreciate your concern. I love what I'm doing. But hey, I'm always thinking of ways to make it better, always thinking of ways to make it better, and you can help. So, from booking the show to preparing for the guest interviews and reading their books and articles to hosting the program to editing it and posting it and promoting it. I do it all right now, and I'm trying to think of ways that we can all benefit. You can get content on the program, important issues, important guests that you've already sent so many of. So I'd love to have you be a part of a team stand up, because I think together we can do so much more. And I also like to think that it gives you purpose and meaning to be able to contribute and to help out and have these important issues that we learn about and grow from every day be something that you're contributing to more actively, perhaps, if you would like. No responsibility, just if this is something you'd be interested in doing. There's so much more that I need to do. I need to share the videos of the interviews. I need to have more. I really would love to have more subscriber relationship building. I'd like to do more of that. I need to promote the podcast in so many other ways. I need to put out my stand-up comedy special that I taped a long time. But I also need to walk my dog, meditate, read, research, exercise, and do whatever the girls and Val need from me. And I could use your help. So if you want to be on Team Stand Up, if you have a skill set, if you have an interest, I would love to have you. So email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com, and put in the subject Team Stand Up, and I promise you I will put all of those in a folder. I will invite you all to a Zoom, and we can talk about what we might do together. Sign up for Team Stand Up, whether you are a subscriber or not. It would be helpful to hear your ideas. So that is what I'm going to do. Maybe I'll host a clubhouse. I was talking on Twitter Spaces last night with comedian Dane Cook, who I've known my whole career. Not well, but we've crossed paths a number of times. There's always been a mutual respect there. I'm not one of his haters. But he was just talking about how great Clubhouse is. And it really motivated me talking to him last night. And then I was texting him tonight, and it just really seemed to click for me. So thank you to Dane Cook. Appreciate it, man. All right, I've been talking way too long, and hopefully this doesn't sound self-serving, because I really want you to do this to give many of you the purpose that so many of you seem to really love to have when you contribute and help make a difference here on the program and the discussion that we're having each and every day on this journey that we're on together.
It's no commitment. It's an easy thing to implement. Team Stand Up with Pete at gmail.com. All right, so that is something I just want to introduce here up front. I'm really excited to hear from you and your ideas. I cannot wait, actually, to see those emails start coming in. StandUpWithPete at gmail.com. Team Stand Up, what can you do? How do you think we could work together to build a great program each and every day that's interesting, informative, enlightening, maybe inspiring, and perhaps entertaining at times as well? So coming up, a really great, fascinating conversation with the always awesome Tim Wise. But first, it's time to take a look at yesterday's news with the last 24. All right, here is the latest news in COVID. The World Health Organization is saying more people have been diagnosed with COVID in the past 2 weeks than in the first 6 months of the pandemic, which is a crazy statistic and continues to rage in Brazil and India, two of the most populated countries in the entire world. 120 deaths per hour now in India. Could stay bad for months there. The FDA is expected to authorize Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine for children as young as 12 by next week. I'll talk about that tomorrow with Dr. Arthur Kaplan and much, much more with him as well. The number of people now that have their first COVID vaccine dose has declined in at least 47 states as the country approaches 150 million vaccinated people. The White House will reallocate some COVID-19 vaccine doses away from states with lower demand to those where demand remains high. And a lot more COVID headlines as well, of course, but that's what I've got for you. The leader of the House, Republican, Trump supporter Kevin McCarthy, trashed his third in command, the Republican House Caucus anti-Trump Republican Liz Cheney, on a hot mic, and the Beltway media now saying that she'll be gone from leadership as soon as next week. I've got a few audio clips for you on that analysis, of course. And Senator Ted Cruz went down to lick the boots of the guy who said his wife was ugly, his dad killed JFK, and that the election was fraudulent. That picture was going viral in the last 24 hours. Also, 23 dead, 65 injured in a horrific accident. It looks, I'm sure, an accident, I hope, in Mexico, where an overpass collapsed and a train went down, and it was just horrible. And it's sad that we need to see something like that, hopefully to shock the public and conscience and politicians into investing into our infrastructure here in America so those kinds of things don't happen, because they have here, and we need to not have that happen. All right. Let me first get to the President of the United States, who made some important comments and commitments on Tuesday.
I've been saying this a long time, but I really believe this is not a Democrat or a Republican issue. Science behind the vaccines has been under development for decades. 2 of our vaccines were authorized under prior administrations, Republican administrations. My administration, the Democratic administration, is doing the work to get hundreds of millions of shots in arms. While we may not always agree on everything, this is one thing people across the political spectrum can agree on. So I want to thank prominent conservatives like Mitch McConnell and a large group of Republican members of Congress who have medical training, who have advanced getting vaccinated. I also want to thank the 105 million Americans of every background who are fully protected from one of the deadliest pandemics in our history. You know, there's a lot of misinformation out there, but there's one fact I want every American to know. People who are not fully vaccinated can still die every day from COVID-19. Look at the folks in your community who've gotten vaccinated and are getting back to living their lives, their full lives. Look at the grandparents united with their grandchildren, friends getting together again. This is your choice. It's life and death. And I hope everyone knows within themselves it makes the choice that is going to help them and their loved ones be safe. Get our businesses open again and get us back to normal.
All right, and President Biden set another lofty goal for COVID vaccination in adults. He hopes to reach 70% of adults with at least one shot by July 4th. And now let's check in with the experts. Dr. Anthony Fauci appearing on CNN Tuesday with the Wolf, expressing cautious optimism about where the country stands in relation to the end of the pandemic, whenever that might officially be. Here it is.
If the FDA does grant authorization next week, how soon could we actually see the first vaccinations in this 12 to 15 age group?
Oh, essentially almost immediately after. Wolf, we can implement that right away. Once you get that, it's sort of put onto the EUA of the original efficacy trial in adults, and it's something that can be done very expeditiously.
Pfizer also said today it expects to request emergency use authorization for kids ages 2 to 11 in September. Could this eventually become a safe, routine childhood vaccination?
Absolutely, Wolf. That's the ultimate goal. You want to do what's called an age de-escalation. We now have it from 12 to 15. We showed it was safe and effective. Then you work your way downward from 12 to 9 years old, 9 to 6 years old, 6 to 2 years old, and then 6 months to 2 years old. So we would hope by the time we get to the end of calendar year 2021 and the beginning of the first quarter of 2022, we'll be able to vaccinate children of any age.
Before I let you go, Dr. Fauci, you and I are Major League Baseball fans. What inning are we in as far as this COVID pandemic is concerned?
Well, you know, we're at least halfway through. I hope we're seeing, and I do believe, Wolf, I'm not trying to be overly enthusiastic about what's going on vis-a-vis the vaccine program, which is so successful. But we've really got to not declare victory prematurely. So we're in the late innings, but it's not over. That's the thing we really got to get people to appreciate. We're going in the right direction. We're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. But now's not a time to declare victory. It's a time to get more and more people vaccinated. Just the way the president said today, we want to get to that goal. It's a doable goal, and I believe we'll get there.
So you think the 7th, the 8th inning, or late innings? What inning are you
Easy,
talking
Wolf.
about?
Come on.
How about the bottom of the 6th? Try that one, Wolf.
All right, I'll go with the bottom of the 6th. That's not too bad. All right, Dr. Fauci, as usual, we'll go to a baseball game one of these days. Thanks so much for joining us.
And you know he will. You know he's going to go to a baseball game with the Wolf. That'll be hilarious. If you look down and saw Dr. Anthony Fauci and Wolf Blitzer just hanging out at a baseball game. And not to drop another name in with, you know, I mentioned Dane Cook earlier, but Wolf Blitzer once gave me his basketball tickets to the Washington Wizards. And I took Steve Clemens, formerly of The Atlantic, now with The Hill. Come on, your boy knows everybody. I'm glad I don't know this guy because I've just played you the President of the United States and then Dr. Fauci talking to the Wolf. But now here's really part of the problem. Here's what we have to deal with. Anti-masker this week berating Costco customers for supposedly lacking manhood and refusing to join his anti-mask rebellion inside of the Costco.
Is anybody tired of this tyranny?
What?
You love tyranny.
Every yell no at him.
You love tyranny. You get out. You get out. You get out. No more masks. No more masks.
All right, so this idiot started a no more mask chant, and I think there was a guy that went in the store with him that was chanting with him. It was just the two of them, but everybody was sitting there heckling him, and they kicked him out of the store. But then not before he got a couple more rants in. This is really emblematic of what we're up against.
No, you know the funny thing is, in 6 months or a year from now, you're going to be looking for people like me to stand for you.
That's right. No, I'm
Where's
good.
the men at?
What?
Where's the freaking men at that will stand for your liberty?
Right here. Thank you.
Where's the men that will stand for liberty once again?
Thank you for not putting a mask.
Liberty comes with a mask. Liberty comes with a mask. Please.
Somebody yelled at him, "Liberty comes with a mask." It's a great. I love that. He didn't know what to do with it. Now, let's be clear. These people are a minority of Americans, but there are way too many of them. But I think it's important that we realize that most Americans are not necessarily crazy, but it's far too many. And the virus of ignorance and apathy and terror, racism and sexism. I mean, these types of guys yelling, "Where are the men at?" I mean, that is just the most misogynistic bullshit, obviously. It's on the move. It's on the spread. So that's why I do the show every day, certainly. And I love having all of you listening and learning along with me and what we can do to stand up against this horse shit.
All right, now to prove that, let's go from the crazy guy in the Costco to the brilliant leader in Georgia, Stacey Abrams, who had this to say yesterday.
I am concerned about whether my party, which tends to be over-representative of communities of color, of communities that are disadvantaged and marginalized, that the party to which I pledge allegiance, or at least I have given my fealty, that the party could lose. But I honestly want us to return to the fundamentals of voting. It's the people who lose. The forerunners of autocracy and authoritarianism begin with limiting who has access to the right to vote, making it so difficult that people give up and abandon the perquisites of democracy. That makes it much easier for those who do not intend to share power to hoard it. And so I am deeply afraid, and it seems like slightly hyperbolic, but in a nation like the U.S. with its changing demography, if the response to increased participation by communities of color, by young people, by women, if the response is to restrict their access and impede their participation, that is a very, very strong signal that we are heading in the wrong direction and that our democracy is not safe, it is not sound, and it is not resilient. We have to be better than that.
Yeah, I'm going to always continue to listen to and follow Stacey Abrams until I see any good reason not to, for sure. Okay, and you got to talk about the big story yesterday that dominated certainly cable news. The Axios got the scoop that Kevin McCarthy, who is the Republican minority leader, of course, in Republican caucus in the House of Representatives, got caught trashing Liz Cheney, who's basically his deputy. I believe she's the number 3. On a hot mic on Fox News. So in case you didn't hear that, and to have some context, so when I play the analysis, you know what was said, because I think this is super important development, and there's some good commentary around it. But let's start with what was said on that hot mic by Kevin McCarthy.
I think she's got real problems. I've had it with her. It's, I've lost confidence. Well, someone just has to bring emotion, but I assume that will probably.
All right, so that was, boom, big news yesterday that leaked out. And do you think he meant it? I don't think so. I don't think he knew that was happening. Is that the way he wanted it to get out? Well, lots of analysis, great analysis on it. I just want to play a couple of clips for you. First, here is what Jen Psaki had to say to a reporter. I'm not sure if this question was asked before that the tape was out or not, but everybody knows that this has been a real tenuous situation in Republican House caucus between Liz Cheney, who has some standards and principles and is telling the truth about the insurrection, and Kevin McCarthy and most of the rest, apparently, of the caucus. Here she is with the reporter, Jen Psaki, yesterday.
Well, I would say first that, the Republican Party seems to be spending a lot of blood, sweat, and tears trying to figure out where they stand and what they stand for, and that's their prerogative. But our focus is on and how we're spending our time is on defeating the pandemic, growing our economy, building on that for the long run. And it's no secret that the president doesn't see eye to eye on many policies with Congresswoman Cheney, but his view is that the American people elected him and also many people representing them in Congress to solve problems for them. And he's going to continue to seek civility even when he disagrees.
All right, now here's Republican strategist Tim Miller on MSNBC talking about the drama in the Republican caucus.
This wasn't inevitable, right? There's this thing that there was this sort of inertia that got us to here where this kind of had to happen because it's what the Republican base wanted or whatever. But it isn't. It was about choices that all of these people made, all of these men made mostly, in order to suck up to Donald Trump. And the choice that they're going to make next week, according to Jake's reporting, is that the only member of Congress that is going to suffer any consequences from the siege on the Capitol that was inspired by Republican lies is the one woman who's willing to speak the truth about it. Okay, so on January 6th, you had Lindsey Graham, and you had, saying that it was time to move forward. You had Mitch McConnell saying this was an attack on our democracy. All of these, Kevin McCarthy said it was unacceptable. All these guys could have gotten together and said, we're gonna make a change right now and show that this is unacceptable, and we're gonna move forward. And Liz Cheney could be in good standing. And when I listened to Jake and the member that he was talking about, this is a common point that you're kind of middle of the road Republicans say Liz Cheney is the one that's doing this to herself because she keeps bringing up January 6th and Trump. Nobody talks about Donald Trump more than the Republicans. It's not the Democrats who are still talking about Donald Trump. The NRSC gave him an award. Rick Scott flew down to Mar-a-Lago to hand him the Freedom Award. I'm on the NRCC's text list. So Jake, they text me every day about Donald Trump. Sign up to show your support for Donald Trump. So they're not the Republicans in Congress are not trying to move forward. It's not like there is one side that says, let's move forward for Trump, and then Liz Cheney who wants to relitigate the past. The two sides are Liz Cheney, who wants to tell the truth about January 6th, and the other side who wants to keep telling the lies and keep standing by Donald Trump. Those are the two sides, and that there's a class of Republicans that are trying to elide that fact and turn what Liz is doing into something that it isn't.
That's Tim Miller, great analysis on MSNBC. He's at the Bulwark now, Republican strategist. And one of my favorite writers and opinion makers is Paul Waldman over at the Washington Post, and he has a great piece about this whole controversy, which is so important. This really isn't just a gossip story. This is very important because it is the near future trajectory of the entire Republican Party and, conservative movement. And Paul Waldman writes in Washington Post, he stopped repeating, "This is not normal since Trump left office, but it is absolutely not normal that in one of our two major parties, it is considered an unforgivable apostasy to say that the last election was legitimate and that lying to voters is wrong." Think about that. I can promise you that every Republican considering running for president in 2024 certainly has. He goes on to write more about what the campaign is going to mean, but he says they know that most of their party has bought into Trump's lie that the election was stolen. According to a recent CNN poll, 70% of Republicans say they don't think Biden legitimately won the election. 50% believe that there exists solid evidence proving that Trump actually won. If any 2024 contender contemplated disabusing the party's base of those beliefs rather than pandering to them, they surely rejected the idea in an instant. And he finishes by saying the 2024 candidates aren't going to make that mistake again. Whatever the base wants to hear, any lie, any conspiracy theory, any ugly impulse forged in the depths of their resentments and fears, the candidates will mirror it right back at them. Unfortunately, that may not do them much harm at the ballot box, just as the party's nihilistic conspiratorial turn probably won't keep it from regaining control of the House in the 2022 midterm elections. Politicians seldom have much incentive to stand up to their base, no matter what the base thinks, unless their integrity prevents them from doing so. But in today's GOP, integrity is in awfully short supply. Paul Waldman in the Washington Post, read the whole thing. This is going to continue to be a major story and theme of the future of the Republican Party, whether or not they're dealing with facts and truth on the election and the reaction to it or not. And it colors every single thing that they do. All right, the other big story coming up today is if you're listening on Wednesday, the 5th, that Facebook is going to decide whether or not to reinstate Donald Trump. And a couple things on that real quick. Jen Psaki offered a one-word response to a question about that yesterday.
Can I pivot to one other thing? This week, Facebook is going to decide whether or not to reinstate Donald Trump's accounts on Facebook and Instagram. If he is reinstated, is there any change in strategy that the White House would put in messaging? In other words, if he's on these platforms expressing his views, does that change what you do at all?
No.
She went on to expand upon that in a statement later on, but I also wanted to play for you on that analysis on the Facebook Oversight Board decision. Saw this on Chris Hayes' show last night. This is Adam Connor. He's the Vice President of Technology Policy for the Center for American Progress, or CAP. But he used to run the D.C. office for Facebook, and he's really the best guy to weigh in on this. Here he is.
Absolutely. And I think Evelyn and what the writings have done has hit a lot of these issues head on. But I think, look, I've been thinking about what politicians can and should do on Facebook for, I think, maybe longer than anyone else in the world. And to me, this isn't particularly hard. Donald Trump shouldn't be let back on Facebook and Instagram because he's already proven himself to be such a clear and present threat to democracy. And I think that is really the issue that is most important. I think what the Oversight Board and others want to also talk about is whatever broad precedents this may set for leaders across the world. But I think if you look at the facts of the case, it's really important to keep in mind that this was the tool, Facebook and Twitter was the tool that Donald Trump used to delegitimize the election. We did some research at CAP And in the 65 days between the election and the insurrection, Trump only appeared on camera 28 times, but he tweeted and Facebooked 2,200 times. And a majority of that was to delegitimize the election. So this is a tool that he primarily uses to tear down democracy. And I think having seen what happened after the Mueller report and impeachment, we know what happens if he gets exonerated or let back on the platform. He's just going to continue to do that over and over again, even more.
At this point, you probably know Facebook's decision in terms of listening to podcasts. When you're listening to it, you probably know it's supposed to be 9 o'clock on May 5th. So that's a very important decision. I really hope he doesn't get back on social media. He did launch his own, quote, he called it a new media platform, but then it was made fun of all day because Donald Trump basically just launched a blog and it's nothing. It's just a website. It's nothing. So he got made fun of for that all day. Now, I also finally want to play for you a little Merrick Garland. He is the Attorney General, and he was up in front of Congress on Tuesday to ask for more funding for investigating and prosecuting domestic terrorism. And the Attorney General was asked basically what keeps him up at night in terms of concerns about the national security of the American public.
So my oath is to protect the Constitution and Americans from all enemies, both foreign and domestic. And so both forms of terrorism are of extraordinary concern to me. We never want to take our eyes off of what happened on 9/11 and of the risks that the country continues to face from foreign origin terrorist attacks on the homeland. Likewise, we have a growing fear of domestic violent extremism and domestic terrorism. And both of those keep me up at night. Every morning, virtually every morning, I get a briefing from the FBI in both one or the other or both areas. Since the last time I was in the Justice Department, when both were concerns as well, the lethality of weapons available to these kind of terrorists, both foreign and domestic, has increased. The consequence of the internet and encryption means that they can send information and make plans much more swiftly and in greater secrecy than could have been done before. So we have an emerging and accelerating threat, and the department is putting its resources into defending the country with respect to both. And needless to say, this is an all-of-government problem and an all-of-government solution. Department of Homeland Security, extraordinarily important in these areas. And with respect to the foreign threats, obviously our intelligence services and the Department of Defense.
All right, that is the Attorney General Merrick Garland. He said or I think 47,000 times in just that 2-minute clip alone. So not exactly the most effective communicator by that measure, but I think he knows what he's doing, and, well, I hope he does. Okay, that is the last 24. All of those stories and sound bites pretty much took place almost always in the last 24, during the last 24 hours, which is just another reason why this is the best news recap you can find on any daily podcast. Thank you very much for joining me. But I do have more news. Yes, I do. It's called the News Dump. It's basically everything else rapid fire right now. Today's News Dump jingle is written by singer-songwriter, listener, subscriber Phil Round and performed as always Pete Coe. Here we go. Haven't heard this.
Wrinkled, naked mole rat, perky, pink, and plump. He's sitting on your face for today's news dump.
That's great. That was great. Was that Phil at the end with the noise? Oh, well written, well performed as always. There's the jingle, and here's the dump. We'll start in Los Angeles, where a U.S. tax court has handed a major victory to the estate of Michael Jackson in a years-long battle, finding that the IRS wildly inflated the value at the time of his death of his assets and image, leading to an estate tax bill for his heirs that was far too high. Okay, well, not sure why you needed to know that, but I guess I thought that was interesting. Oh, here's another legal settlement. Pharma company to pay $12.6 million to settle kickback allegations. A Delaware pharmaceutical company has agreed to pay $12.6 million to resolve allegations that it violated the Federal False Claims Act by paying kickbacks. Department of Justice officials said in a news release Tuesday that the settlement resolves allegations that Insight Corp improperly used an independent foundation to cover the co-pays of certain people taking the company's cancer drug Jakafi from November 2011 to December 2014. Jakafi is approved to treat a bone marrow cancer called myelofibrosis. I hope I said that right. One Washington, D.C. police officer has been fired and 3 are under investigation in a squad car drag race crash. Did you hear about that? Yeah, I guess they were racing in Washington, D.C., their police cars, and so they're in trouble. Nice work, fellas. Serve and protect. Okay, Hyundai is recalling over 390,000 vehicles in the U.S. and Canada for problems that can cause engine fires. Yeah, you never want that when you hear that your car is being recalled. You don't want it to be something about the brakes or a fire. The largest recall covers more than 203,000 Santa Fe sport SUVs from 2013 to 2015. And apparently also some brake fluid can leak into the anti-lock brake computer, causing an electrical short that can lead to fires. Owners should park outdoors and away from structures until the problem is fixed. Yikes, Hyundai owners. Let's head to Northern California, where a condor egg is hatched in the wild there, the newest member of the Pinnacles National Park's recovery program for the endangered species. The egg hatched April 12th after 2 months of round-the-clock incubation by both parents who protected their fragile egg from the elements and potential predators, park rangers said in a social media post. The 2 condor parents have been a pair for about 5 years. How sweet is that? This is their 3rd offspring. They are condors 589, which is managed by the park. The other parent, 569, is managed by a different organization. Anyway, condors typically have 1 chick every 2 years, but these 2 have been doing their part to keep the species going. Good job, 589 and 569. I like happy nature stories. CBS has gotten their quarterly returns. Apparently, their profits in 2021 have jumped 11%. How about that? Do you like CVS or Rite Aid? What chain pharmacy do you have in your town or state? Or do you go to an independent pharmacy? That would be cool. A lot of questions about the Bill and Melinda Gates marriage ending. How will they split their $146 billion fortune is one of my favorite headlines of the day. Or least favorite. It depends on how you want to look at it. The IMF is warning that a global tax deal is urgently needed. I thought that was an interesting headline. Montana is paying bonuses to people who are willing to work because there's unemployment, extra unemployment pay due to worker shortage there in Montana. Beginning June 27th, unemployed workers in the state will no longer receive $300 in extra weekly benefits, foregoing payments that were approved through September 6th. Instead, the state will launch a new program to provide bonuses to unemployed workers who return to work. Let's see how that works out for them. All 10 of them in Montana. No, I kid my Montana listeners. Hey, Martin Lecalot. We talked to him last week at the Stand-Up Happy Hour Hangout. He lives up near Missoula, where he says it's pretty awesome. But I think he's gainfully employed. All right, that is your news dump for Wednesday, May 5th. And now it is time to get to my first and only guest on today's program and one of my all-time favorite human beings to talk to. He is an anti-racist and speaker who I have been speaking to for well over 10 years on my various iterations of my program, from CNN to SiriusXM, because I think he's one of the smartest guys in the world. He's a scholar, he is a writer, he is an anti-racist speaker, which his work goes all the way back to being a college activist. He's the author of 7 books. Most recently, you gotta get his book, Dispatches from the Race War. Subscribe to him on Medium and support him on Patreon, and check him out online at Speak Out Now. He is on Twitter at Tim Jacob Wise. We talked about everything from critical race theory to why he won't debate douchebags like Dinesh D'Souza these days. D'Souza, he did 7 times in the past. We had a great conversation. It's always great, but I think this is one of my favorite. he just holds court, and he's just so great, and I love talking to Tim. I hope you'll say hello to him on Twitter, support him, buy his new book. Here we go right now with the great Tim Wise. First of all, I was on YouTube, and I looked up critical race theory because I wanted to find some scholarly conversations, thought maybe I'd find some links of you talking about it. And all I found were right-wing assholes and quote, think tanks. And what is going on? YouTube is littered with right-wingers talking about and criticizing critical race theory, which we don't even know what it is yet.
Right. Well, and neither do they, which is one of the reasons that YouTube is littered with it, is that what the right has done in the last year in particular is they've decided that essentially critical race theory is anybody or any analysis of American society, which starts with the assumption that racism is still a real problem and has always been a problem in America, which is essentially what we used to call facts. We used to call it just history, right? Accurately taught. But to them, that's critical race theory. Ever since the 1619 Project, at the New York Times was released, which was informed by critical race theory, although it's not written by critical race theorists per se, their argument has been, how dare you say that enslavement and white supremacy were foundational to America? Well, any real historian knows that that's true. And so what these people are doing is they're producing all these videos to attack any kind of left or progressive anti-racist analysis, whereas those who are actually critical race theorists are oftentimes talking about, giving lectures, but they can sometimes be somewhat dry and very specific about, race in the legal system, race in the school system. Some of the lectures are fantastic. Gloria Ladson-Billings does critical race theory in education, amazing work, but you're not going to find her stuff because it's very specifically tailored toward actually addressing issues, not inflaming people. So it's not going to show up on the algorithm. You're not going to find a lot of old lectures from Derek Bell, who's one of the foundational critical race theorists in terms of critical legal theory. There are some good pieces of Kim Crenshaw and others out there. But for the most part, critical race theory, if you turn it into the abominable snowman, or you turn it into Frankenstein's monster, that's going to get more attention than what it really is, which is really very simple. And this is the question that critical race theory was devised to answer, is this question: how is it that in spite of the real and hard-fought victories of the civil rights era, in spite of those, which critical race theorists do in fact acknowledge, contrary to Tim Scott, contrary to what the right says, we don't ever recognize progress. That's not true. The critics are very clear. The question is, why is it that in spite of those victories, which were very real, and by the way, fought by leftists and fought by progressives and fought by liberals, not right-wingers who hated the movement from the beginning, why is it that in spite of those victories, we still have such fundamentally ingrained institutional white dominance in every institution? Because that's a paradox, right? How is it that you can have these victories and still have such inequality? Critical race theory seeks to answer that question. And the answer it offers is that inequality is not a glitch. It's a feature of the society. Whereas those on the right are saying, oh, no, it's like, mistakes were made, quote unquote, and now we're going to unmake them. Critical race theorists are saying, no, actually, inequality was not a mistake. It was deliberate. And if you don't understand that, then you end up being satisfied with the glacial pace of change. If you understand that it was intentional, then you begin to realize you have to take apart the machinery and create different institutional norms. It shouldn't be that scary. But to think that maybe the system is inherently flawed is very frightening, I think, for a lot of white Americans, and particularly those on the right.
You say it shouldn't be that scary. Tim, have you seen these YouTube videos of these town halls, these school board meetings, and these white people terrified of this being taught in their schools? High school teacher in my daughter's district reached out to me and talked to me about a little bit about a mumbling in our district of people starting to get worried. Of course, we can talk about the workplace, but I want to pick up on that. White people are scared.
Well, and here's what's crazy. You mentioned the school board stuff. So I'm sure you saw the video from Idaho, right, where there's the school board member, or maybe it was a parent or both, who is freaking out about the teaching of, wait for it, not Derek Bell, not Kim Crenshaw, not Ibram Kendi, not me, To Kill a Mockingbird. To Kill a Mockingbird, because apparently Harper Lee was the founder of critical race theory. And that book, which, if anything, is like a white savior narrative. Like, if there's any flaw in To Kill a Mockingbird, it's the fact that Atticus is the would-be hero, right? But no, to them, they're teaching our children that black people have been oppressed. Holy shit, that story's about the 1930s in Alabama. If you can't even accept that black people in Alabama in the 30s were oppressed, your kids will learn nothing from school because you're damaging them at home. You need to keep them locked in a closet somewhere. I'm not serious. I don't want you to keep your kids in a closet. But for God's sake, if you can't even say, yeah, it was sort of rough being black in Alabama in 1933, then we have nothing to talk about. But that's what these white folks are saying. We don't want our kids to learn about the history of enslavement, the history of segregation, the existence of Jim Crow laws. There was some woman who's the head of New Orleans Republican Women's Club that posted on her Facebook page the other day, well, what about all the good that happened in slavery? What about the slave owners that loved their slaves? Like, this is where we are. And to your point, the reason that white folks are so afraid right now, making an issue of this in a way that they didn't when critical race theory was created, which was in the 80s. In the late 80s is when this school of thought begins to really develop. But white folks didn't freak out then. You know what the difference is? The difference, in addition to, social media making some of this stuff go viral, but it's also the fact that in the 80s and early 90s, white folks still could look out at a country that pretty much we had hegemonic control, right? The popular culture, the economy, the political culture was still so white dominated. I would argue it still is at the highest levels, but our popular culture, our political culture, we're much more multicultural, obviously, in a lot of ways today. And even though the power structure is still disproportionately white. And so when white folks look out at America in 2021, that's why they say make America great again, because they preferred it the old way. When MTV first when they play music, but then second when they didn't play black people, right? And when you say I want my country back, like the Tea Party did, that's the anxiety, not economic anxiety, as some folks insisted the Trump people were, but cultural anxiety, that the realization the country's changing. Tucker Carlson every night going on talking about replacement theory. They're bringing in the brown people to take your spot. All of this is part of a campaign intended to scare white people into thinking that they are being dispossessed of, quote unquote, our country. This is stuff that 30 years ago, when I started doing this work, only David Duke was saying. And the only people that were saying it were people like David Duke. David Duke is the figurehead ideologically of the modern Republican Party. He won. Dukeism triumphed, and we are living with the consequences of it 30 years after he actually lost those elections.
Wow, that is sad, but also hard to disagree with if you understand a little bit about what he thought and spouted, which of course is where you got your start fighting that guy in Louisiana. You have this great article, your most recent piece, which is available at Medium, The Problem with Racial Progress Narratives, Exposing the Toxic Positivity of Conservative Race Theory. It's such a great piece, and there's so much nuance in it. Everybody has to read it, but it's one line that kind of, I think, stood out. And of course, now I can't find the exact line, what it was, but you basically wrote about using data. The white people have never really seen much of a problem, or didn't think there was a lot of a problem. And, or that things got better after this event or the civil rights movement somehow. But you also have the specific line I'm thinking of is about after segregation happened, white folks tended to think a lot more. Well, it's over. We're all living together. Everything's fine. And I think that, and there's a lot of data that you used a bit. I think that is such a profound point as to when white folks got even more settled in thinking things were fine. Why is it so? Where do we jump out of in terms of segregation? In terms of going from segregation, thinking things are fine, I guess everything just got better then.
Well, but the thing is, as I point out in the piece, the target is constantly being moved by white folks. And so, yeah, after civil rights laws were passed, obviously, the vast majority of white folks said, OK, that's it. No more structural racism. But the thing is, White folks didn't think there was really structural racism even before the civil rights laws were passed. And the lesson is, therefore, you really shouldn't listen to white folks on the whole tell you if racism is a problem, because what the surveys demonstrate, and I embed them in the piece, at every level, you go to 1961 and you look at white folks being asked in one of the surveys, do you support the freedom rides, right, which were seeking to desegregate the buses? Prior to that, in 1960, do you support the sit-ins? Right? Do you support black people protesting for their rights? And in every single poll, the overwhelming majority of white people, I don't mean 50% plus like 3 people, I mean like 70% said, no, I think this is awful. It's divisive. It's not necessary. It's going to cause more harm than good. In 1963, as I note in the piece, Gallup, asked white people that year, this is before the Civil Rights Act has been passed. It's before the Voting Rights Act. It's before the Fair Housing Act, 5 years ahead of that. And they said, do you think blacks are treated equally in your community? Now, in retrospect, we're 58 years away from that. We can look back and go, my God, of course not. That's why the movement was happening. But in 1963, 2 out of 3 white people approximately looked around and said, yeah, I think everything's fine. What does that say? And I'm sure if you had dug deep in those polls and said, well, what do you mean? They would have said, look, I mean, think about how much progress we've made. It was worse in the 30s. And then if you go back to the 30s, they would have said, well, at least it's not slavery. And then if you go back to slavery, they would have said, well, at least they're not in Africa, right? Like this is what white folks do. We just keep looking in the rearview mirror, amazed at how far we've come. Right. But as I said in the piece, that's like looking at my kids, and I know you got kids, too. Like, I don't know about yours. Mine were pretty cool when they were 7 and 9. I like them a lot more now that they're 17 and 19. But holy hell, if they get to be like 40 and they haven't gotten their shit together quite a bit more than they have up to this point, I'm not going to be satisfied to be like, well, they're better than they were in grade school, so cut them some slack. Right. That's not the way we analyze things. And we wouldn't do it in any other area. We would never say to Jewish folks, and I happen to be Jewish, no one is going to say to me, well, unless they're a Nazi, perhaps. No one is going to say, well, Tim, I mean, I know that Jewish synagogue was desecrated with some, graffiti, but at least you're not on the train to Sobibor. Like, what? Like, that's not like, well, Treblinka, they closed that, there's no more Auschwitz. So you're okay. Like, that's not the way we analyze things. We are, as a country, a place that says, this is who we are. Liberty and justice for all. This is who we are. This is our promise that we make. So the only analysis should be, how are we doing relative to the promise? Not how are we doing relative to our great grandparents, who shit outdoors in a wooden stall. Like, that's not the way that we do this.
You speak for your own great grandparents.
Yeah, yours had boring, I'm sure.
My great grandparents had a bronze toilet. Actually, I don't think my mom had plumbing at the beginning of her life.
Well, if they had been Trumps, they would have had gold toilets.
Oh, God. They're going to have to sell them eventually just to get out of jail. One can hope. Okay, so the other point, another way of making that point, which I often hear, and I want to get your take on this, because you write a lot about policy. You have a great essay in Dispatches from the race war about this kind of thing. Sorry, am I here?
Yeah, you're back.
I just wanted to ask, a lot of times people say the war on poverty didn't work because people are still poor. So kind of saying what you're saying here in terms of how we analyze things, give me an example of how policies do work and how government policies have worked. And I absolutely want to talk with you about kind of the Biden agenda, but that's not why people are still poor. It's the government has actually done a lot of good things, but we still have a long way to go, right?
Well, I mean, first of all, if the idea is let's cancel the war on poverty and stop funding it because poverty's still here, then that means we should definitely defund police tomorrow because crime is still here. So I'm glad we can agree on that. But we don't, right? So that's not actually an argument. Secondly, let's be real clear. The war on poverty and the anti-poverty programs of the 1960s actually did work when they were being fully funded. So from 1960 to about 1973, poverty overall was cut by about 38% in this country. Now, that wasn't just anti-poverty programs. We also had a strong economy. But what that proves to you is that you can have anti-poverty programs and a strong economy at the same time, and that will in fact work. It didn't keep people trapped in poverty. It didn't create generations of dependence. economics. The reality was it was working. Black poverty in particular was cut by like 42% or something in that 13 to 15 year period. But after the early 70s, those programs either were eliminated or they were frozen. Their budgets were frozen, not adjusted for inflation. So between like 1973 and 1996, which is when welfare reform was passed, the value of benefits had fallen by about 40% because we hadn't kept pace with inflation. So surprise, surprise, if you have benefits that don't keep pace with inflation, folks are going to stay poor and they're going to fall even further behind. There's nothing shocking there. That's basic economics. So it isn't that anti-poverty efforts don't work. We know they work because they brought white people out of poverty after the Great Depression. Right. Those programs were aimed at the white poor and they were specifically targeted to white people. Black folks were excluded from a lot of them. And you know what? It worked. Programs that were aimed at elderly poor people worked. It brought down the elderly poverty rate from like 60% to 8% because of things like Social Security. So when we are serious about anti-poverty efforts, they work. But when we aim them at everybody, and especially if they're perceived as benefiting those people, meaning black and brown folks, those are the ones we put on the chopping block and we decide, oh, no, big government's bad. The taxes are too high. Government's too big. But government literally created the white middle class. Government created that. FHA loans, VA loans, GI Bill, all the New Deal programs that were racially targeted really to white people and excluded for black people. Those worked. They worked. They created the white middle class. Without them, there is no white middle class. It certainly didn't exist before, no matter how hard white folks worked. Before the New Deal, you had rich and poor, and there was very little in between. When we were serious about creating opportunity, it worked. Once those programs got labeled as black folk programs, brown folks programs, as Martin Gillens at Princeton talks about in his work, that's when all of a sudden they fell out of favor. And the irony is there are millions of white people in this country right now who don't have adequate health care, who don't have adequate nutrition assistance, who don't have adequate housing, can't afford their rent, don't have adequate incomes, and they're hurting too because we've decided to stigmatize these programs because the undeserving black and brown folks over there, well, not only are they not undeserving, but by thinking that they are undeserving, you end up cutting off your nose to spite your face and cut the programs that you need as well. And that's what all the research says. The reason that our quote unquote welfare state is so cheap and so chintzy and so Swiss cheese like is because of the racialization of poverty and need. Once you racialize poverty and need, then you decide, oh, well, we don't need these programs anymore. And then a lot of white folks who need them don't have them either.
I think what you're talking about, generally speaking, is when these programs that get stigmatized had to do with food aid, housing, health care, helping pregnant women and so on. But it would also seem that, that was the past. But now the current situation is the words and programs that are now demonized as programs that generally benefit or are used by black and brown folks are public education and public transportation. And that's why things like that, there's this movement, obviously, to privatize public education, of course, and public transportation is just not invested in. It just doesn't work well enough, except for, of course, where it does in places like Manhattan, where rich people use it or middle class people use it. I mean, so what does that mean that these programs that weren't demonized and stigmatized then now seemingly are as well?
Well, increasingly, anything that has the word public attached to it sort of has this mimetic impact of conjuring these notions of racial others, cultural others. So whether it's public schools, public parks, public transportation, public health, that's one of the reasons when President Obama talked about even briefly a public option, that ended up getting such negative feedback because, public option, that means black. Public option, that means, Latinos. Well, no, it just means that people can buy into the equivalent of Medicare, which is a public option, but that it conjures these notions. And so part of the problem is that we have associated blackness and brownness with having to rely on the government. And we've assumed that white folks have all been these self-supporting, self-sustaining people who created something out of nothing. Therefore, we don't need public goods. But the reality is, even with the push to, attack public education, 91%, Like 91% of students in this country are still educated in public schools. The vast majority of people that would be working for every company, agency, organization, nonprofit, government agency, whatever it is, are going to be educated in public schools. So the idea that you're going to be able to shortchange public education and not affect yourself, the idea that you're not going to have fully funded public transportation. Well, what does that mean? In cities like Nashville, where I live, where people can't afford, young people can't afford to live in the city because the prices have jumped so much. They're having to live like 30, 35 minutes away, but they're having to have a vehicle or 2 or 3 vehicles in their home, depending on how many people are in their family, so they can get back and forth to work, because we don't have light rail. We don't have public, because God forbid, if we have light rail, see the black and brown folk from the city and even the liberal city folk will come out there to the country. We saw that in Atlanta several years. This has been 2 decades now. One of the reasons that they didn't extend light rail into some of the exurban areas was because, even though, have you ever been in Atlanta traffic? Those white folks will stay in traffic for 3 hours a day rather than get on public transportation, because the problem with public transportation, it goes both ways. So not only would you be able to go downtown, they'd be able to come out to the country. Like black folks even want to come out to your neck of the woods. Like they don't want to come out there. But God forbid they want to go to the Olive Garden, and we can't have that. Yeah. So we're going to shut that shit down, and we'll just stay in traffic, and our blood pressure will go up, and our car maintenance bills will go up, and our gasoline bills will go up, and we won't see our kids in the evening, because by the time we get home from work, they're already asleep. But at least the black folks couldn't come out to our mall. It's incredibly short-sighted.
Yes.
That's what we've done for years.
You mentioned Obama and the public option, and I wonder, just kind of transitioning into the Biden administration and the kind of things that he is trying to get done right now, and already, frankly, has. It was Barack Obama was the black guy sprinkling goodies on black people. Was a perception that you were never going to just break amongst a certain frighteningly high percentage of Americans. That was just the idea. The black guy is going to give, handouts to black people. And now the white guy is basically giving handouts to everyone. And it's still being demonized as, poor people and so on. It's interesting watching the Republicans have a little bit of a struggle demonizing these amazing opportunities for everybody, especially middle class folks. But what do you make of that transition? What do you make specifically, Tim, of the ideas that you've seen the Biden administration and Democrats trying to sell the American people right now in a short period of time that they have?
Well, I appreciate the efforts to try to get people to think in much bigger terms than what has been the case in the last 2 Democratic presidential administrations. The last 2 administrations of Obama and of Clinton, both tried to play small ball. Both were about, let's bunt and get on base. And you can win games bunting and getting on base, don't get me wrong. But if you really want to change fundamentally the direction of the country, that probably isn't going to work. And if you're up against an opposing force that is ready to just burn the stadium to the ground, right? The idea that you're going to be able to play small ball and they're going to respect that. No, because they won't. Because when they get back in power, they're going to attempt to undo everything, whether it was tiny or whether it was big. So whether it's Obamacare or whether it's public option, whether it's a tiny infrastructure bill or a huge infrastructure bill, whatever it is, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be a $1 an hour boost in the minimum wage or a $20 an hour boost in the minimum wage. They're going to try to undo everything. So if that's the case, you have to actually speak in a clear voice. You're not going to win a lot because, look, the way the structure is the way the structure is. And with the filibuster in place and the way that the Senate, overly empowers these tiny states relative to other states that represent 20 million more Americans, the rules are rigged in such a way, that it's very hard to get a lot done. That's super progressive. But what we know is that when we have gone big, it is very hard to unspool that which is done.
Yes.
That's really big, right? Medicare, folks wanted to unspool that from the day that it passed in the 1960s, but it was really hard. And you know why? Because it touched a lot of people's lives. Even Obamacare, which is not nearly as big as Medicare by any stretch, and inadequate in a lot of ways, but it was the biggest thing that the government had tried to do since Medicare. And as much as they wanted to get rid of it, and man, did they want to get rid of it, they couldn't. Now, I'm sure they'll try again if they get back in power, but they couldn't. And so what does that tell you? It tells you that the bigger that you go, one of 2 things will happen. Either you won't get what you fight for, but you change the narrative. right? You change the dialogue, you change the discussion in that direction. Or you might actually get some stuff. You may not get everything that you want, but you'll get something, and you will then create a constituency for that thing, which is exactly why Tucker Carlson and all these guys are worried about immigration, which is sort of funny in a way, because I don't think that, obviously it's partly just scare tactics. The Democrats are bringing in these brown people to vote. Undocumented people can't vote, and they're not voting. You know how hard it is to vote? You have to be a naturalized citizen. That doesn't happen in like a month. That takes years to become a citizen where you're going to be able to vote. So they know that that's bullshit when they say that we're importing voters, those of us on the left. Yeah. But what they are worried about is a recognition that culturally, people who are coming to this country who haven't necessarily been steeped in the same, hyper individualistic, uptight, waspy kind of ideology that existed as the dominant ideology in America are going to have a different view about the collective good, right? Some of those folks are going to be pretty conservative on certain issues. And I'm not going to see eye to eye with certain newcomers. A lot of the folks that are coming to the country, probably a lot more religious than I am. Some of them, are very devout Catholics. We're going to have disagreements on certain issues, but they have a different way of looking at the collective good when it comes to things like economics, when it comes to things like education. That's what they're afraid of. They're right that is going to change America. The difference is that some of us realize it's going to change America for the better. And it's going to create new opportunities for us to actually create a different kind of collective. But that's why they're freaking out, because they realize that once you craft a different narrative of what America could look like, I don't mean racially and demographically, I mean culturally and systemically, people will gravitate toward that. The reason they don't want certain people to vote, and I'm not even talking about immigrants now. I'm talking about black folk born and raised here. I'm talking about young people, right? That they don't want. Matt Walsh, over at the Daily Wire, wants to limit voting to people that are 25 and older who pay net income taxes and can pass a particular civics test. The reason that they don't want certain people to vote is they realize their vision is not attractive to most people. It is not attractive to most human beings with a pulse. Most carbon-based life forms do not like their worldview. Yeah. And they know that. So if most people reject your worldview, you have to reject most people. That's what they're about.
So well said. Hey, have you ever debated a guy like that who's nowhere near in your league, and why would you lower yourself to debate him? But someone like me would love to see you eat him alive on some kind of equal footing. Do you ever get invited, and would you ever do something like that? I can understand why you wouldn't want to go on certain people's network shows or something like that where they control it all or they could have edit. But if it was like some kind of actual equal duel, would you meet someone in a forum somehow like that? Because I'd love to watch it.
I used to do that a lot. In the earlier days of my work, I debated Dinesh D'Souza 8 times from 1996 to about 2002 or 3. And this was Dinesh before he became a Trumpy kind of, this was like Reagan Dinesh, right? Yeah. And Dinesh now has become, post his incarceration, post his felony record, he has become a totally even more bizarre individual than he was. And there's a lot there to unpack as to why that is. But I debated him back when he was relatively grounded. And I came to the realization after 8 times that it was fun and it was funny and I enjoyed the performative element of it, but it wasn't real productive because ultimately I came with my crew, he came with his crew, and everybody went home with their own crew afterward thinking their guy had won the debate, right? And so what I have said since is this. As much as I love to mix it up, and obviously, I come from that kind of background. I was a debater in school, and that's my thing, and I like it. But honestly, though, as an educator and a tactician and an activist or whatever, I am also fully aware of the unproductive nature of most debate. So what I have said since then, I've been approached a couple of times. A couple of years ago, somebody wanted me to come out to Cal State Santa Barbara, I think it was, and debate Ben Shapiro. And I said, I didn't reject it out of hand, which is what some lefties would have done. They would have said, screw that, I'm not doing that. Other people would have jumped at it because, it'll be fun. But my thing was, look, I'm not interested in debating really anyone in this sort of adversarial, let's swap data and let's, get all our facts and see who wins. What I'm interested in would be a conversation, a dialogue, even with someone who I find as objectionable as Ben Shapiro, but a dialogue where we're not discussing what we think, we're discussing why we think it. And let's be clear about why that's an important difference. I think sometimes when we're debating what we think, it's just a pissing contest, right? We're just arguing, beating each other up. It's adversarial. It's not productive. What I'm curious about is this, and I'm humble enough to acknowledge it for myself. I would love to tell you that the reason that I think the things that I think about race and America and privilege and inequality is just because I'm so smart and I got all these books behind me and I've read them all and I know more than everybody else. But that isn't it. The reason that I know what I know or think that I know what I know, the reason that I see the world the way I see it is because I've experienced certain things. It's because I grew up in schools where I saw the black kids who were close to me and were my friends and played on ball teams with them. I saw them treated differently by teachers. I saw them treated differently by security or by cops. We went out when I was 11 or 12 years old to play ball in a nearby community, and we had white kids refuse to play us because our team was mostly black, and they surrounded the car and called the black kids the N-word and called the rest of us who were white N-word lovers. I saw that. I experienced that. So and then I had a roommate after college, black guy who got his ass beat by a cop after they accused him of mugging a white woman a couple of blocks away. He was like, what the hell are you talking about? He told him to screw off. They took him, they grabbed him, they shoved him in a police car, split his lip. He's bleeding all over his shirt. They take him down and pull him out of the car in front of this woman who they think he mugged. It's like an on the street lineup. This is entirely illegal, entirely unconstitutional. They pull him out, they hold him up by his shirt and they say, is this the guy? And this woman, to her credit, was like, that's not even close to the guy. And the cop says, are you sure? Look God. Closely. And she says, no, man, that's not him. And he's like, I'm going to give you one more chance. Is this him? And she luckily wouldn't play along. She's like, no, let him go. They were so pissed off that they couldn't arrest him that they threw him back in the car, split his lip again. They finally drop him off 6 miles away. He had to walk home. That happened the same month that a member of the New Orleans Police Department came up to me. I was trying to break into my girlfriend's car with a coat hanger because I've locked myself out. This cop comes up to me, doesn't know this is my car, doesn't know I have a right to be in the car, could be stealing the car. And this dude comes up and tries to help me break in.
Excuse me, sir, you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, told me I was doing it wrong. Same month that they did this to my friend. So what I'm interested in is not what Ben Shapiro thinks or what Dinesh thinks or what Matt Walsh thinks or what Ted Cruz thinks or any of these guys. What I'd like to hear them explain to me is why do you not see what I see? I'll tell you, I'm not objective. I'm not going to say it's because I'm smarter than you guys. I'm not going to say it's because I know more. I think I'm right intellectually, but I also know that I come to the evidence with a certain lens. I'm willing to own that, but I don't know how many people on the right are. I'm curious. The reason you don't see white privilege is because your lens is different. The reason you don't see systemic racism is because your lens is different. And I wish we could be honest enough to start with that instead of acting like, oh, we're all objective and we weigh the evidence. No, nobody really is that objective. We all have certain by the time we start studying this stuff, by the time we read these books like the ones behind me here in my office, I've already sort of got an opinion, right? And we all sort of play this game where it's a lot of a confirmation bias. We all do it, right and left. The difference is, are we willing to acknowledge it? Because I feel like if we could do that, then we could humanize each other. I don't have to see you as evil if I realize that the reason we disagree is because we've just seen some different shit. And it's okay. Like, as long as you're willing to hear what I've seen and I'll listen to what you've seen, then maybe we can at least not hate each other. We might not ever agree, but we don't have to go at each other to where these folks are posting that critical race theorists are trying to destroy America. And I don't have to think that everybody on the right is some vicious, horrible Nazi. I know better than that. Right. But the reason we're at each other's throats is because we spend a lot of time debating and not a lot of time discussing these issues and being honest about our own frame of reference.
It's so thoughtful. I love the way that you framed that, not what we think, but why we think it. I'm so glad I asked that question because I wasn't certainly planning on asking that question, but I was just thinking about it. And you mentioned that guy, Matt Walsh, and it made me think I'd love to see Tim just talk. But wow, we took a departure that I certainly am so glad that we did. That's so interesting. It really makes me think about not only why I think,
what I think about race when it comes to black folks, but also about women and girls or the environment or anything else, and why I care about even economics. I mean, it's really an interesting subject. I wanted to ask you also, you mentioned about, what works. You don't want to do things, certainly at this point in your career, if it's not effective, if it's not productive, if it doesn't work to create the change that you want to see and have always wanted to see. And so I think, that's why it's interesting to talking about this idea of critical race theory. I want to get back to that, which is, I talked to my friends in the federal government who, under the Trump administration, they had to stop this programming that they were offering. And I'm not sure if they were mandated or not, but they're federal government employees at, say, Fish and Wildlife that taught them about diversity and inclusion and important issues. I had to learn these issues when I was at SiriusXM, the HR workshops about, sexual harassment and what it is and all of that. And this is a lot of what we're talking about when it comes to corporate America, organizations, and then when it comes to teaching this stuff in schools. And my question to you is, where it is applied, before we talk about the Trump administration and now Republican governors and legislatures also suspending this programming and demonizing this idea of critical race theory. But my question to you is, does it work? Can I come into your company, to your school, and teach something with a slideshow, a PowerPoint presentation, or a powerful story? And does it do what we hope it would do? Because, and my quick answer is, I think it does work. It worked on me, worked on my mom as a public school teacher. But you do a lot of this type of work, I know, and you've educated so many people. You're an educator in so many ways. Does it work? What is being debated right now?
I mean, the evidence is pretty mixed. I think most of the things that go under the rubric of diversity, equity, and inclusion training probably aren't very effective long term. But that's not because they can't be. That's not because these dialogues can't be productive. It's because, generally speaking, we have sort of two schools of thought in that work. Right. The first school is like the old school that you saw in the 80s and the 90s, where it was every time you come into a company, for instance, it's about the bottom line. How is diversity good for our bottom line? It's the business case for equity. Well, all right. That's fine, but that doesn't really keep most people in the work, because this is also an ethical issue. So when you boil it down to this, how can I make more money for my company? Well, then somebody else comes along and they say, well, actually, diversity, creates conflict in the institution, and maybe you'd be better off to not have that conflict. And, you don't want to have to navigate those tensions. So maybe diversity is not good for the bottom line. To me, that's an unproductive conversation. And even when it's productive, it's somewhat cynical. I'm not interested in helping you. I mean, I did a training for Ford Motor Company when I was like 30 years old. And I said, listen, if y'all brought me in to teach you how to make more money, y'all are a multi-billion-dollar corporation. I got like $72.12 in my bank account. So you clearly hired the wrong guy. So there's that school of thought. I don't think that has any effect.
And by the way, you put me up at the Detroit Motel 8. What's that all about?
Right. The other school of thought is sort of more, and I know people who are in this school of thought. These are people on the left within the anti-racism community who their school of thought is like, I got to go in there and make people uncomfortable on purpose. Like that, like my pedagogical trick is to see if I can get you upset because that's proof that it's working. I think that's bullshit too, because as a pedagogical tool, as an educator, it's one thing if you get upset because the content is challenging. That's fine. And I'm never going to soft pedal it for you to keep you from getting upset. But if I see my goal as to trigger some reaction in you as evidence that I'm doing the work, that is some me shit right there. That is about me. That is about me wanting to feel like a badass. And I'm telling you, as a teacher, any teacher will tell you, if you make the student uncomfortable, the student doesn't learn. The student shuts down. Your psychology kicks in, and now it's fight, flight, or freeze. So why am I trying to piss you off just to prove something? And so I think the reason it doesn't work is we've either got people who are trying to be way too badass and radical because they think that's the work, or people that are trying to be way too corporate and soft and they think that's the work. And the reality is it's a little bit of both of these things. It's about having some self-interest and some connected interest convergence between people of color and white folks, between men and between women, and between straight and cisgendered and LGBTQ. Yeah, we can talk about that, but it's also about telling the truth and being honest. And I think that if these trainings really delved into the institutional norms, like when I do these trainings, I don't spend a whole bunch of time throwing around buzzwords like privilege and throwing around buzzwords like fragility and throwing around buzzwords like oppression and throwing around even the term white supremacy. Now, those are fine terms to use. I'm not criticizing those who use them. What I did one this morning before we got on the call with a group of just white men in this particular organization. And I told them what we're going to be talking about are the institutional norms that we take for granted that are not about bigotry. They're not about personal bias, whether it's subconscious or conscious. The implicit bias training stuff is 99% bullshit. Not that it's not a real thing. Implicit bias is a real thing, but most of the trainings don't do anything about it. So I said, we're not talking about that. This is not about, are you a racist? This is not about coming in and saying, well, of course you are, because we all are. And then forget it. That's an interesting conversation. We can have that another time. What I'm interested in, what are the things in your workplace or your school or your whatever that you take for granted when it comes to evaluating job applicants, when it comes to evaluating the work product of job applicants, when it comes to admissions for school, when it comes to grading papers in school, what are the things that we do every day that we take for granted that we think are fair, that we think are normal, that might be creating or recreating inequality? Let's talk about that. That's the structural stuff. That's the institutional stuff. I don't really care about your subconscious conditioning yet. We'll get to that. But you got to understand that we've got all this shit that's beneath the waterline, like the iceberg. 15% you see, 85% you don't. The 85% you don't is doing the work. The 85% you don't is what sank the Titanic. They saw the top. Right? They didn't see the bottom. And so you've got to be prepared to look at the norms, the stuff that seems fair, because otherwise we're just looking for the bigot in the room, and that's boring. And so I think if we were doing that, these trainings would be more effective. What's interesting is to watch the Republican legislatures that are banning these trainings. If you actually read what they're banning, it's like I could read that and go, okay, ban all that shit, because that's not critical race theory. Right? Like the stuff they're saying they want to ban, they're like, we're going to ban any teaching that any group is inherently oppressive. Okay, well, critical race theory doesn't think that white people are inherently oppressive. So you can ban that bullshit. That's not even what critical race theory is.
Right.
Right. But the problem is all this stuff is getting caught up in it so that they're trying to, say To Kill a Mockingbird is critical race theory. They're saying that any discussion of enslavement or segregation is critical race theory, that any discussion of institutional inequity is critical race theory. Right. So if everything's critical race theory, nothing is critical race theory. And the reality is critical race theory is one particular school of thought which you are free to disagree with. By all means, disagree with it. But it simply says that inequality in America is not an accident, and it was not incidental to the founding, that it was instrumental to the founding. And I don't see how anybody can argue the point, but feel free. Let's have the discussion. What you ought not do is cancel, for those who care about cancel culture, the discussion, because it's pretty obviously a respectable position for historians to take. If the very first thing that Congress did in this country after the Constitution was ratified is to have passed, and this is the first thing they did, the Naturalization Act of 1790, before they did anything, before they figured out the army, before they figured out taxes, before they did anything, they're like, listen, guys, before lunch, this is what we need to do. Let's pass this law that says who can be a citizen and who can't be. Oh, and by the way, all free white persons and only free white persons can be citizens. That's our first order of business. Good. We can wrap for the day. That was the first thing they did. So if that's the first thing that they did, they told you it was the most important thing. And they told you that it was deliberate. It's not like oh shit, we forgot to make black people citizens. No. That was quite deliberate. Right. So that's what critical race theory is saying. That was on purpose. It's not a glitch in the app that you're going to get an update for and you're going to be able to download a patch, right? Like you're going to have to reconstruct the machinery. And if one wants to disagree with how we reconstruct it, that's a great discussion to have.
Yeah.
Right. But to say that there's nothing to reconstruct, well, again, is there or isn't there? If you're saying make America great again, something's broken. The question is, where do you locate the brokenness? And what we're saying is it's been busted up from the start for some people. It's working fine for others, but it's been broken for everybody else for a long time. And other people are saying, oh, no, it was all good until that black guy became president. Then he broke it. Right.
Yeah, which
makes more sense.
Which brings me to my final question. If you have however much time you have to answer, because I think this is a really important, obviously, thing. You gotta ask. You have to get your take on it. You wrote a great piece about this, but when you talk about, the system is designed this way, and we need to break it down, get inside, and argue about how to fix the system. I want to ask you this final question about how we apply that to policing in America, and law enforcement, and the relationship with law enforcement and the public, not just, by the way, black folks, but the public in general, how they see us. You wrote this really important piece called Justice for One is Not Justice for All, and of course about the Derek Chauvin case. And I wanted to ask you, your top line reaction to the verdict on that, as it maybe applies to my question here, which is what needs to be done to get under the hood and the machinery of law enforcement and policing in America.
Well, the first thing is we have to really acknowledge that the history of policing and law enforcement was always about protecting the haves from the have-nots. And that both had a racial implication and an economic implication. It wasn't really about, protecting and serving all, whether it was slave patrols or whether it was those who were, intended to control the white working class, the, European peasant class, the Irish in New York, who then became police in many instances. But when you think about the history of law enforcement, it was always about protecting the haves from the have-nots. And if you have a system that's predicated on that, then you can't be surprised 100 years later or 200 years later or 300 years later when that system is still unequally policing certain people, whether that's black and brown folks on a racial level, working class and lower income folks, including working class and lower income white folks on an economic level. That's what it was created to do. It really wasn't crafted to, we think of law enforcement as stopping harm, right? Or stopping wrongdoing. But here's an interesting fact. According to the FBI, wage theft, by employers, meaning, not paying workers what they're owed, maybe not paying them overtime, not paying them, not giving them their tips, not giving them, not paying them for prep work if you work in a restaurant, whatever, lots of different ways of stealing your employees' wages. Wage theft every year, just the amount that is recovered every year from wage theft is 3 times more money than all the robberies and burglaries put together in this country. And yet, who goes to jail? If I'm an employee and I steal $1,000 out of the till, I'm going to go to jail. Very good odds. If I'm the boss and I steal $1,000 out of your paycheck or $50 every week for a whole year, what's going to happen to me? If you can find an attorney to take your case, you can sue me. And even if you win, I ain't going to jail. I might have to pay you back pay, but good luck. Probably you won't even be able to afford an attorney. You'll probably just quit and find another job. So we don't have a law enforcement system that's actually about preventing harm. We have a law enforcement system that's about policing certain people and not other people. And that has a racial and an economic element. If we want to actually protect from harm, we have to have a discussion about what does public safety really look like? What do you mean when you say public safety? What are the greatest threats to public safety? Well, it might be getting held up in the park, but it also might be a corporation that's dumping its medical waste in my neighborhood or its industrial waste in my neighborhood. There's a lot of different ways to harm people. We know that for years and years, the disproportionate lead infestations, both in paint and in embedded exhaust fumes that settle into the soil of urban communities, have had a deleterious effect, a damaging, destructive effect on cognitive development, on impulse control, on people who live in neighborhoods who are lead poisoned, that have major effects on brain development and physiology. And actually, we know that lead poisoning is actually even correlated to law breaking. But rather than deal with the thing that helps contribute to law breaking, we just say, oh, you broke the law. Now we're going to lock you up. Freddie Gray in Baltimore is a great example of this.
Yeah. Yep.
Here's a guy who is killed in police custody, supposedly a quote unquote career criminal, to hear them tell it. Freddie Gray had like 3 times the amount of lead in his blood that is even the norm for the Baltimore area, let alone considered safe, which the government says there's no safe level of lead poisoning. His family was actually part of a lawsuit against one of the biggest violators of lead, of contributors to lead poisoning in Baltimore. So this is a guy who literally was killed twice. He's killed by the police, but he's also killed, in effect, by this systemic problem that no one wanted to address. But rather than deal with that on the front end, we wait until the damage is done to people. And then when they bring that damage out into the world and commit a crime of some sort, then we think that we can either lock them up or we can beat them up or we can potentially kill them, and the problem is solved. And what I think those of us who are talking about fundamentally reimagining what public safety ought to look like is, why are we waiting and until the damage is done on the back end when we could be directing these resources to families and to communities to stop problems on the front end? It's not going to end entirely the problem of crime. No society's ever going to, get rid of all law breaking and wrongdoing. But the idea that we need this billion and billion, maybe $1 trillion over 10 or 15 or 20 years apparatus of law enforcement, when the vast majority of it is not going to stop real, dangerous people in the first place, but it's harassing folks that are slinging weed on the curb. It's, dealing with loitering. It's dealing with quality of life, offenses, quote unquote, broken windows, policing, and all that bullshit. Why do we need all this money for that? Why do we want to put the money there, knowing full well what that does, both in terms of the community's relationship to whatever kind of public safety apparatus we have, but also what it does to the public's perception of who is dangerous? If you spend a lot of time harassing and arresting people for some petty bullshit, you feed the mentality that those are the dangerous people, not the folks stealing your wages, not the folks polluting your water and your air and your soil, right? Not the folks who are running companies that are violating occupational safety and health, not that, but these other people, the have-nots. And so we have to understand the origins of law enforcement and how it came to be this way, so that we understand the function that it is serving right now. If we're going to unspool it, you have to start with the history, which is, again, what critical race theory tries to do, is tries to figure out what is the predicate to the thing that you're seeing right now. And a lot of times we don't want to go back to the predicate. We just want to say, well, here's what I see right now, and let's deal with it. And so when Ma'Khia Bryant was killed in Columbus, right, and the conversation devolved into, well, she had a knife and she was going to stab that girl. So what was he going to do? Okay, two things. Number one, if this had been any other country on earth, just about, certainly any other industrialized Western country, a cop who comes upon that scene is going to have to deal with it differently, either because they don't have a weapon or they've been trained to hardly ever use them, right? So what is a cop in everybody's got knives. Every country, even ones that don't have a lot of guns, have lots of knives. What do? You would have had to do something different. So if there was something else you could have done in Sweden or Denmark or wherever the hell, then why couldn't you have done that here? Well, because you weren't trained to do that here. You were trained to respond with lethal force. It's not the only option, but it's the one you checked into because that's how you were taught. But the second question is, why are we only starting the analysis about her killing after she's dead, instead of saying, wait a minute, perhaps there was a whole edifice here, including the foster care system that she was part of, including the economic system that she was part of, the educational system that she was part of. Why are we waiting till the end and saying, well, this was a good kill or this was a bad kill? Why are we doing that? Why are we not saying, no, our job is to create a society where not only will she not get killed, but that girl that she was supposedly going to stab won't be in danger either, and where that cop doesn't have to pull a gun on a teenager and kill her either, where nobody in that scenario has to play the role that they ended up playing.
And in one of the best investments you can make on that front end is early childhood education, pre-K, which is what they're trying to do right now. I mean, the analyses of that are what that means in terms of outcomes for young people. Ma'Khia Bryant's age, by the way, are overwhelming as to what it means when you get early childhood education, much as so many of these other ideas that we can talk about that other societies, including societies in the United States of America, actually do employ, which is why you have less crime, less mental health issues, more opportunities for employment and healthcare and education. And you could see where it works and why it works. So, Tim, thank you so much.
Oh, you bet.
So great, as always. I really appreciate it, and I will give all the plugs on the way out because everybody's got to support your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good talking to you.
Yeah, I did not do much talking. I just let him rip. Let him rip. Wind him up. Let him go. So happy to have him. So articulate. Statistics and research. He's been doing this a long time, and I loved it. I love that conversation. I hope you did, too. That's all I got for you today. Follow him right now on Twitter at Jacob Wise, and let him know you heard him here on Stand Up. That always means a lot. Give me a review on Apple Podcasts. If you're not done that yet, go on Apple Podcasts and write a review.
It makes a huge difference. Subscribe there. And if you haven't already signed up for a paid subscription, do it now. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic. We'll go to the paid subscription link in the show notes. Hope to see you tomorrow night. That's Thursday night at the Hangout, Stand-Up Happy Hour Hangout, 8 East every Thursday night. And anytime on the Discord platform, we can always hang out and connect there. Don't forget, you want to join Team Stand Up and help produce this show and content for it, just send me an email, standupwithpete@gmail.com, Team Stand Up, and I'll invite you to a separate hangout to talk about what we can do together. Oh, wait, that's it. I'm out. I'll talk to you tomorrow right here on Stand Up, where I plan to have Slade Somer of The Recount and Dr. Arthur Kaplan, who is one of the most respected bioethicists in the country. Looking forward to that, and I'll talk to you then. Don't forget to recognize the thoughts that you are thinking. Be mindful, folks. I love you. Goodbye. Take it away, Johnny Carroll.
The devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. Don't get up off of your butt, down off of your fence, even if it ain't a very friendly audience. Well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense, and you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town, just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up, and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says